A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us all today. I am Judith from URA, and I will be your webinar host. Today's webinar is held in conjunction with the Urban Sustainability R&D e-Symposia 2021, which is a year-long series of webinars that will cover research themes and innovation topics in the space of urban sustainability. Our webinar today is titled Analytics in the City, and it focuses on the research and use of data analytics, modeling, and simulation for planning and design. We have a very interesting program lined up for you today with distinguished experts in public health, geographic information science, and ecosystem services. Before we begin, I would like to invite Ms. Kathleen Goh to give the opening address. Ms. Goh is the Director of the Physical and Digital Planning Department at HDB's Research and Planning Group. Ms. Goh, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Under the Research, Innovation and Enterprise, or RIE 2025 plan, MND Cities of Tomorrow, or COT, is a key R&D program under the Urban Solutions and Sustainability Research domain. For the next 5 years, this R&D program aims to fund research to address national challenges, build resilience in the built environment, and secure Singapore's continued success as a livable, inclusive, and sustainable city-state. This is especially relevant as Singapore continues to tackle various urban issues and transits into a post-pandemic era. COT comprises various verticals and horizontals, targeting different dimensions of the built environment. Today's webinar focuses on the first key horizontal enabler, H1, on urban environment analytics, which is co-led by URA and HDB. R&D conducted under H1 seeks to harness latest advancements in technologies to transform the way that we plan, build, design, and manage our towns and districts. We hope that insights from this horizontal can drive improvements in how we understand the people, the environment, and find new ways to carry out urban planning and design that achieve higher standards of livability and maximize the well-being outcomes for our residents. Under RIE 2025, H1 will focus on two broad themes. The first is data analytics, modeling, and simulation, which contain 4 sub-focus areas. Firstly, land use activities and modeling, where the aspiration is to understand travel demand patterns with a greater appreciation so that land use and facilities planning can be optimized. Secondly, we would like to establish clearer links between the built environment and its impact on a person's well-being. With this clarity, we hope to shape our living environment in ways that better support positive well-being outcomes. Thirdly, we aim to better understand the impact of polycenters, which will further value add to the national decentralization strategy. And finally, we would like to deepen our understanding of human and wildlife behavior to better plan for parks, recreation spaces, and eco-corridors while managing potential conflicts between human and wildlife. The second theme is AI technologies for urban planning. As urban planning is a complex process that needs to be tailored to the local context, R&D here seeks to develop decision support systems which could improve the base of planning knowledge, quality of decisions, and with greater efficiencies. So we look forward to working with you to push the frontiers of the urban analytics research. And I trust that the speakers in the next segments will contribute significantly to this goal. Thank you. Back to you, Judith.
Thank you, Ms. Goh, for sharing with us about the research areas of interest under the Cities of Tomorrow horizontal and urban environment analytics. If you are active in any of the research domains here or would like to share related expertise, do let us know in the feedback survey at the end of the webinar or drop the e-Symposia Secretariat an email at the email address on this slide. We will now be hearing from our 3 distinguished speakers who have prepared insightful presentations to share their rich expertise and experience. If you have questions about any of the presentations, we encourage you to post them in the Zoom Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. And following the presentations, we will have a panel discussion involving all 3 speakers, moderated by Professor Paul Cheung. We would also like to introduce you to the live Jam board set up for this webinar. The Jam board is a place for you to share any comments or reactions anytime during the webinar, and you can scan the QR code on this slide to go to the Jam board. We really look forward to hearing your views. So our first speaker for today is Professor Martin Raubal, who will share about spatial data analytics for sustainable mobility. Professor Raubal is a professor of geoinformation engineering at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, or ETH Zurich. He's also a steering committee member of the Center for Sustainable Future Mobility at ETH Zurich and a member of the Future Resilient Systems Management Committee at the Singapore ETH Center. Prof. Raubal's research interests include spatial decision-making for sustainability and spatial cognitive engineering. Without further ado, Prof. Raubal, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here actually, and thanks for the nice introduction. Before I start my slides, I want to welcome all of you who are taking part in this meeting. And I have to say, I've been physically to Singapore for 3 months now, and despite the COVID situation, I really got to love this city already. So I'm looking forward for my remaining time here. So I'm gonna share my presentation. I hope you can see that all now. Okay, very well. So my topic for today is actually sustainable mobility and more precisely how we can employ spatial data analytics for sustainable mobility. Now, I want to start with the motivation. As you all know, our society has become increasingly mobile. This is shown actually in the increasing traffic all over the world, especially in big cities. People are always on the move, etc. Now, why becoming mobile, of course, is very good for us as people, it also has some negative impacts. And I found this latest statistics actually from Singapore, because mobility comes with certain CO2 emissions. And if you look at the latest emissions profile, and I'm actually glad that it's from 2018, because this is pre-COVID, where we will eventually probably get back to, then you can see in Singapore, transport actually contributes, when you count primary and secondary emissions, about 15%. Now, actually worldwide, that is relatively low. I give you comparable numbers in Switzerland or Germany are way above 30%, but still 15% is quite a bit of a share in terms of CO2 emissions. And this has a negative impact on climate change. It has a negative impact on our health. So if we can actually have mobility become more sustainable in the future and reduce this output, then we'll do some good for all of us. I also want to link that to, probably most of you are familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And just when you look at mobility, you can immediately see that it affects at least 3 areas. I mean, first of all, good health and well-being for all of us, then sustainable cities and communities, and of course, climate action. And it becomes even more important when one considers worldwide that about 70% of all the people will be living in urban areas by the year 2030. So we urgently need to do something there. Now, why spatial data analytics? Just to give you an overview here, so spatial data analytics is not only concerned to looking at where things happen, but also to understand why things happen at a particular place or location. So in spatial data analytics, we analyze and visualize through various methods, location, distances, and spatial interactions, and these actually serve as the core aspects of the data. And according to some estimation that was done a while ago, actually 80% of the informational needs of local government policymakers are related to geographic location. And this already gives you an impression why space is so important. And in fact, if you look at the various initiatives in Singapore, such as the Urban Planning 2.0, one from URA, geospatial data analytics and planning plays a big role there. Now, to give you a more detailed insight, spatial data analytics, of course, analyzes big spatial data, but it has various components. I mean, on the one hand side, we need to deal with human-computer interaction to actually visualize the data. People will interact with the data and the analysis. And we have several methodologies, of course, for spatial temporal analysis. And I want to highlight that time plays a big role too, especially in transport and mobility. We're able nowadays to provide web services to communicate the information, and on the other end, people use location-based services. They use their apps on their mobile phones and location-aware technology in general. So this is a broad spectrum where spatial data analytics falls into. And now sustainable mobility, I mean, how do you define that? Actually, sustainable mobility has as a goal to guarantee all of our mobility needs in an environmentally friendly way, but over the long term. So we are really here interested in sustainable mobility over the long term. And I strongly believe that if you want to achieve this, then this comes with both technical and non-technical measures. Of course, engineering approaches to make more sustainable transport systems, etc., are important. But I believe that in terms of non-technical measures, like people need to change their behavior in the future too, because otherwise we will face even more major problems. And to give you a couple of examples, what I mean by sustainable mobility, like shared mobility, these concepts have been implemented worldwide, shared cars, shared e-scooters, for example. Then, of course, e-mobility, this is on a fast pace, actually, and I think we'll see much more of that coming in the future, because it has been demonstrated that with e-cars, for example, we can definitely bring down the CO2 emissions compared to conventional cars. And another interesting concept that I will be talking today is mobility as a service, basically services that put different transportation modes together in order to be more sustainable. And I prepared basically 2 case studies from our recent research projects in Zurich that I believe are definitely applicable to Singapore and other cities. The first one is mobility as a service, and the second one will be a project where we investigated people's behavior change. Now, with mobility as a service, I want to present you some results of a study we did with the Swiss Federal Railways operator, SBB. And there was a project done in collaboration with BMW. And basically, the idea was that SBB, the train provider, they said in the future, they want to become more broad, going from offering only train tickets to mobility as a service, participating in different transportation modes. And the big question is, actually, there were 2 big questions there. First, will people use such a service? And second, will that actually help to make mobility more sustainable? So what happened there is, in this research project, people could apply for such a yearly pass. They paid a fee at the beginning of the year. And for this fee, basically, they got a service that covered their mobility needs for a whole year, including an electric car, the charging infrastructure, a free pass for all trains in Switzerland, e-bikes, etc., etc. And this was interesting for us because, first of all, it was a long-term study. Many studies often happen within 1 or 2 weeks, and then often people fall back to their behavior before the study. But this was a study with 139 people in green class 1. And what you can see here, green class 1 means they had an e-car, and in green class 2, there were 50 users. These packages were targeted at the younger population because it was cheaper and did not include an e-car, but an e-bike. You see that we got, so this was a tracking 24/7 for 1 year. And you see that we had about 230 million GPS position fixes in green class 1 and tracked almost 6 million kilometers. And I would like to present you with some of the results, how a mobility as a service can work out. Now, the first result that was really interesting to us is that we have seen over the year that the e-car really became a part of the mobility mix of the people in the long term. What you can see here on the x-axis, these are the week numbers, and around the week 2 to 4, the project basically started, and you can immediately see here with the different transportation modes. Blue is the conventional car, green is train, that after the project started, people substituted the conventional car with the e-car, seen in orange. And that pretty much stayed constant over the year. You see an interesting peak in week 52. And we found out that this is actually the holiday season, the Christmas holidays. And some people were scared that with an e-car, they couldn't reach, that far. That's why they went back to the conventional car. And what we did is we did an analysis also. I don't want to go into detail here, but this is basically the correlation between all the transportation modes. So we could see that, for example, in this box here in blue, there's a negative correlation between car and e-car. That means the less people use the car, the more they use the e-car. And you can also see this 0.13 correlation between e-car and train, that when people use the e-car more, that did not make them stop using the train services, but the train services were also used and stayed pretty much constant. Now, we calculated actually the CO2 output, and what you can see here in this figure, that the average CO2 emissions went down dramatically after the start of the project. They picked up a little bit towards the end, but still stayed way below the beginning of the project. So this gives you an indication that actually such a mobility as a service can help reduce CO2 output and greenhouse gas emissions. The last result is actually from Green Class 2. So Green Class 2, remember, people did not have an e-car, but they had an e-bike. And what you can see here, it was fluctuating more, the average CO2 emissions. There was still, you can still see in the curve that it was going down overall, but we could also see that without the replacement of conventional cars to e-cars, this CO2 emission reduction is unstable. But overall, we were very happy to see that with implementing such a service, we can actually have mobility become more sustainable. The second project I want to show you is somehow about an integration of technical and non-technical measure. This is namely the interesting thing to investigate. Are people willing to change their mobility behavior? And the essential question is, how can we actually accelerate people's transition towards an energy efficient mobility option and overcome firmly established habits, such as when you go from home to work and back, you would just always take the car and not even consider other options. And as I said, we were interested in two specific questions, namely, how can we assess and influence the mobility behavior of people? And we used an approach called gamification. This is app-based gamification to basically nudge people towards more ecological, sustainable mobility. So this project involved an app-based tracking of individual mobility. And again, one of the novel things was it was a long-term study over a year to investigate whether people actually keep their behavior change. Now, what you can see here, this is the app, also without going into detail. So basically, people were tracked with their mobility, and you see on the second map here, the route map, you see the different options. So we employed machine learning algorithms to deduct and actually find out automatically about what kind of mode of transport people used, but they could verify that and were supposed to verify that, and if there was a mistake, change that. Now, in the gamification, there were leaderboards. They could set their own goals. They could compare themselves with other people. And we also had prizes that people could win for the most sustainable behavior. So basically these components, as I have shown, the automatic tracking with the app, GPS trajectories and transport mode, and then we had a gamified app that provided feedback to people on their mobility behaviors, for example, suggesting more efficient routes, social interaction with other people, and challenges and awards. To give you an indication, we did the study in two parts, in a city environment like Zurich, and on the right-hand side in Ticino, which is a more rural environment in the south of Switzerland bordering Italy. And you can immediately see the differences in the tracking. So in purple and blue are public transport modes, and yellow are basically car modes. And you can see that we have a very good public transport infrastructure in Zurich, so people use public transport a lot, but in Ticino, it's often difficult if people commute to their work, to the cities, they have to take the car. To give you an insight about the experiment, as I said, it was a long-term experiment. We started with 600 participants from Zurich and Ticino. We had 3 tracking periods, and we had an intervention and control group. And basically, in the phase. In the first phase, people were just being tracked. In the second phase, the intervention group received the GoEco app and the gamification approaches. And then, in the third phase in C, people were tracked again to evaluate whether a behavior change was long-term or not. As in many of these studies, you have a high dropout rate, but we still had 150 participants in the end and could make significant result statements. Overall, without going into the individual numbers, what we could see is that GoEco could bring about change in people's mobility behavior. There was a clear and significant reduction in both average energy consumption as well as CO2 emissions per kilometer. We detected that mainly for systematic routes, like those traveled on a regular basis, where it was easy to implement a change. And we also saw that for Ticino. For Zurich, we observed an increase in routes by foot and bicycle, but there the sample was a bit too small to generalize to the overall population, but the trend was also going in that direction. Okay, that brings me to my last slide, conclusions. So I strongly believe future sustainable mobility is a complex system, and this depends on highly complex and interrelated technological, social, economic, and political developments. Spatial data analytics, as you could hopefully have seen, can help to first evaluate and predict people's mobility behavior, but also to determine whether long-term behavior change is possible and is happening. And I think reducing CO2 emissions is important. It depends on both technical and non-technical measures. So I showed you mobility as a service and apps and gamification. And overall, if you're looking for one take-home message, then I would say spatial data analytics is essential for sustainable mobility. And with that, I really thank you for your attention. If you have any questions further on, I'm looking forward to those. Here you can also see my email address. And I want to thank the people in my MILAB, Mobility Information Engineering Research Group, who actually did the research that I presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Raubal, for sharing with us about the spatial data analytics for sustainable mobility. It is indeed important for industry, government, and the research community to work together to promote mobility behavior for sustainability. If you have questions for Prof. Raubal, we encourage you to post them in the Q&A feature or post your views on our live Jamboard. Next, we have Assistant Professor Perrine Hamel from the NTU Asian School of the Environment, who will share about modeling the benefits of nature for urban planning. She's also Principal Investigator at the Earth Observatory of Singapore. Prof. Hamel's research examines how green and blue infrastructure continues to create resilient and inclusive cities in Southeast Asia. She has published extensively in the fields of ecosystem services modeling, urban water management, and urban resilience. Without further ado, Prof. Hamel, please.
Thank you, Judith. Let me share my screen to get started. All right, I think this should work. I'll count on you, the URI team, to let me know if the slides are showing okay. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to present. It's my great pleasure to be sharing some of the research my lab and myself are doing on the benefits of nature for urban planning. So switching gears from mobility to city in nature. So I'll start with the policy that some of you in Singapore may be familiar with. And this is the 1 million tree movement or 1 million tree campaign. The idea is simple. There's this objective that is now integrated as the part of the Singapore Green Plan 2030. And so it's a high level objective, and a simple question that we may ask is where to plant these 1 million trees in Singapore. So if you think about it, you can maybe decide to plant them where it's the hottest currently. So we actually target areas that need the most heat reduction. Or you could choose to plant them where people don't have air conditioning, where the need may be the greatest. Or if you take an ecological viewpoint, you could also, and this is obviously a simplified way to ask these questions, you could plant them where butterflies needed the most, or where macaques needed the least, perhaps, if you're concerned about human-wildlife conflicts. So these questions show different perspectives on these questions. And the talk I'm going to give is essentially illustrating how we have tools to translate these questions into urban plans and try to eliminate some of the trade-offs and synergies between different priorities. But first things first, what are nature-based solutions? What are these so-called nature-based solutions that we are talking about when we talk about city in nature? So they come in many shapes and forms. You can see a sample on this screen. Anything blue or green on these pictures is actually called nature-based solutions. So protecting or creating green space. They can be more natural, like our forests or mangroves, or more artificial, like green roofs. But the commonality between all these nature-based solutions is that they provide what we call ecosystem services. So these would be things like air purification. This could be flood risk mitigation. And they can also be things like mental health or physical health, which are maybe less tangible, but that are also important. And so something important to note is that they are not all providing the same levels of benefits. So some of them are better at some of these benefits. And so this is essentially the type of modeling that we are doing in the lab, and that is really important to understand when we want to inform urban planning. So the geospatial tools that I'm using are essentially using geospatial data, urban analytics, to understand how spatially we can understand the provision of these benefits. If you are interested, there is a recent paper that we have published with a large team that is describing this particular tool, Invest, that I'm using a lot and that I helped develop. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular tool because there's already a lot of information available online. But I invite the audience to check the paper as well as the resources. So this is a free and open source tool that really helps making this translation. Just as a teaser, this is one of the case studies that we are using in the paper. That focuses on Shenzhen in China. And so we are using the tool to understand spatially the benefits of nature-based solutions in the city, and then translating them into an economic value, which is the policy context or the need that was highlighted by our colleagues working in Shenzhen. So because this is a research and development webinar, I thought I would not spend too much time on past work that you can find information on, but focus on ongoing work and share kind of the research frontiers that we are addressing and pushing in the lab. The first one is about mitigating urban heat with the Singapore Green Plan 2030. And this is a recent work that is focusing on this green plan that I already mentioned. So for those of you who are not from Singapore, this is a recently launched plan that has a number of targets. And one of them that we're focusing on here is to keep Singapore cool and reduce urban heat by increasing greenery. So the question we asked with a student of mine, Min Wei Chai, is how much can we expect from additional greenery in terms of reducing our temperature in the city in Singapore? So the workflow that we've used for this case study is relatively simple. The idea is to use maps of current land use and then future land use under these potential new land use strategies. Then using this Invest model that I mentioned, we can estimate the change in temperature due to this future change in land use. And then when we combine this with the map of existing residential areas and electricity utility data, we can obtain the change that one can expect in building electricity consumption. So the type of input layers, since this is an urban analytics webinar, are here on the screen. They're not all of them, but it's essentially RESOs, so geospatial information on land use, on where buildings are, on how the climate or evapotranspiration, how it varies spatially, and then some information on essentially how each type of land use behaves from a microclimate perspective. So when we run the model, the first thing we want to do, of course, is to make sure that it's doing a reasonable job at predicting the temperatures. And so in that case, we've used a network of stations, both from colleagues at NUS and also from the meteorological service in Singapore, to see how the model managed to predict for specific times of the day. So you can see that for nighttime temperature, where the performance was better, it ranges from plus or minus 1 degree for the different locations. And so the next step, as I mentioned, is this economic valuation. And this is not the clearest graph. As I mentioned, this is all work in progress. But it shows in gray and blue the relationship for nighttime and daytime, respectively, between temperatures and energy consumption. So the rationale here is that in hottest days or hottest nights, people use the air conditioning more and perhaps other apparels, which means that there's an increase in energy consumption. So we see that relatively clearly with the empirical data. And so when we use this model input information, we can apply it to the two greening scenarios. One would be the increase in the number of parks in Singapore HDB estates by 1,000 hectares. And so this is the scenario that was provided by the Singapore Green Plan. The second one is the increase in the number of trees in Singapore along roads as part of the 1 million tree project. So it's quite subtle, and this is why I zoomed in here. And so same thing here, the color schemes may not be the best, but you can see the lighter shades of red, which shows that in these areas, there's a reduction in urban temperatures. And so it's actually quite subtle, but even given the strong relationship between temperature and electricity consumption, these result in already significant savings from our first estimates. And this is really demonstrating the value of understanding spatially where this tree planting or greening strategy may be the most effective. Second project that I'll present more briefly is a project which is actually conducted not by my lab, but a lab at the Asian School of the Environment, led by Assistant Professor Eleanor Slade, and worked by her student Alexis Goh. And what they focused on was the nature ways that some of you living in Singapore would be familiar with. They've been implemented since 1982, and essentially connecting green spaces. So their question was, how do the key characteristics of nature ways affect their ability to support biodiversity? So they looked at 19 sites in Singapore and collected a lot of samples, 1,000, almost 2,000 individuals, beautiful pictures of butterflies and other insects. And so they also looked at spatial data to understand the context and spatial configuration around each of these nature ways. And so not surprisingly, they found that if there was more natural area in the buffer around a nature way, the biodiversity indices, all of them would be biodiversity indices, actually have much higher values. Same for urbanization. When urbanization decreases, you see these trends. So their recommendations, they have, of course, recommendations for nature ways design in terms of plant selection, landscape management, but more relevant perhaps for this webinar, they also recommend enhancing nature ways in tandem with surrounding areas by this understanding that what is surrounding the nature ways is also very important for urban biodiversity. So the final thoughts I wanted to share is more of a research frontier, and this is work in progress in my lab. And this is related to nature inequity, and there's quite a lot of information around of research around the world focusing on these questions. Here, this is a study conducted by colleagues of mine looking at greenness. Essentially, this is an indicator for how green the city is, and COVID cases in many cities in the US. And so they showed that the higher the level of greenness, the lower the cases of COVID. And so this may be particularly concerning, or at least a reason to pause and think about planning policy when you know that people of color and other minorities may live very often in areas that are less green. That's for the US. And there's also some research, similar research on equity that has been conducted in Singapore. I'm not going to spend too much time on this study, but that's one example where they looked at the distribution of blue and green spaces in Singapore. And so this is the work we're currently conducting, led by a PhD candidate in my lab, Aikin Lim, who is looking at the different types of indicators. Gini is an indicator that some of you may be familiar with to look at equity, but there are other indicators and they actually tell very different stories. This is what we are starting to find. So very important to make sure we know what we're looking at and to inform urban planning with the choice of the right indicators. And just a final thought on this, of course, what I call desktop equity indicators are not the whole story. And again, there's some ongoing research in Singapore looking at older people, lower incomes, less educated, so some population groups that may be less likely to visit outdoor space. So these are things that you cannot necessarily learn from satellite imagery, for example. So there's also a need to understand how people use the space on the ground. So to conclude, I'll finish with the take-homes. Obviously, an important point of my presentation is that nature-based solutions provide a lot of benefits. They are practical tools to incorporate these benefits into urban planning. So I gave an example of urban heat mitigation modeling, as well as urban biodiversity. So these would be simple workflows to show how in practice we can incorporate this information with the example of the Singapore Green Plan. And so some of the frontiers for urban planning would be incorporating equity considerations, which is something that many cities and countries are looking at. And also something that I haven't mentioned, but I'll be happy to discuss in the Q&A, consideration of other contexts as well, rapidly growing in cities in Southeast Asia that bring different challenges. And so how can we use these tools to inform the urban planning in these very different situations from Singapore? With that, I'll thank my lab, which is not complete on this picture. It was taken a few months ago, but they are very much leading a lot of this research, and I invite you to go and check additional information on our website.
Thank you, Prof. Hamel, for sharing with us about modeling the benefits of nature for urban planning. There is so much potential for us to plan for urban nature in a manner that maximizes and ensures equity in the benefits from urban nature. If you have questions for Prof. Hamel, we encourage you to post them in the Q&A feature or post your views on our live Jamboard. And some of these questions may be addressed later during the panel discussion. Our final speaker for today is Associate Professor Alex Cook. who will share with us about the role of modeling and analytics in public health response using dengue as a case study. Prof. Cook is the Vice Dean for Research and Domain Leader for Biostatistics and Modeling at the NUSF Sweethawk School of Public Health. His research areas include infectious disease modeling for diseases like dengue, influenza, and other respiratory pathogens. He also researches population modeling to assess the effects of evolving demographics on non-communicable diseases like diabetes. So without further ado, Prof. Cook, please.
Great, thank you very much, Judith. And it's a great honor to be able to present some of the work that we've been doing over the last decade, actually, between my modeling group in the School of Public Health and our colleagues at the National Environment Agency. So I'll be talking about dengue in the urban environment, and I need to give a little bit of context about dengue before I can do that, because otherwise some of the later on points I'll be talking about won't make so much sense. So let me just give you a very, very quick dengue 101 for the benefit of the audience. So as you know, dengue is a mosquito-borne infection, but not all mosquitoes spread dengue. There are actually only two culprits in Singapore, Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. Aedes aegypti is the one which is the more competent vector for spreading dengue. It loves people, likes living around our homes. And when you see the adverts for doing like the Mozzie wipeout, they're focusing on Aedes aegypti because it is the primary vector responsible for spreading dengue. However, there is a second mosquito species, Aedes albopictus, which also can spread dengue. Albopictus is less fussy about what she eats. So aegypti feeds primarily only on humans, but albopictus can eat other animals, can feed off the blood of other animals as well. And as a result, albopictus spends more of its time in greener areas and less so much around about our homes. Now I mentioned she when I was talking about albopictus. It's a little known fact. It's only the female mosquito that bites because she needs to get blood for the protein in their blood in order to lay her eggs. The male mosquito is actually vegetarian. And I'm showing you here, I was walking along the street with some NEA officers, and one of them stopped me and said, "Hey, look at that plant. You can see there's two male mosquitoes on it." I'm not sure if you're able to see the male mosquitoes. Can you? Okay, so there's one and there's the other. NEA officers, I should say, are fantastic, right? We were literally walking along the street and she was able to spot that. The male mosquitoes live off the sap of plants. Okay, now how can modeling and analytics try to contribute to our NEA officers' work? I think that there's two main ways that we can use modeling and analytics in the context of dengue, and I'm going to relate it to another use case, which is about climate and the weather. So the first of the two main situations in which we use modeling in the context of the weather is obviously for weather forecasts. And so the purpose of weather forecasts is that we're taking what we know about the atmosphere, what we know about the laws of the atmosphere, what we know about the current configuration of like what's the temperature, what's the rainfall, etc., and then to make short-term predictions, which may be useful for our decision making. In the context of dengue control, the analogy would be that if we can forecast number of dengue cases over the weeks or months ahead, then this can impact on how we make decisions about rolling out public health campaigns. So for example, when we're going to put the banners up outside your estate, or when we're going to alert hospitals and doctors that we have a potential epidemic looming, therefore make sure there's enough spare bed capacity in the hospitals, for example. So that's the first of the two main kind of use cases that we would use modeling for in the context of weather and climate. The second, which is of course very topical just now, is for long-term projections of the impact of our policies on eventual outcomes. And the idea here is that we want to be able to give guidance to policymakers. If they do X, what will happen? If we do Y, what will happen? And in the context of dengue, that would be things like, if we expand our Wolbachia control program, how many cases do we think we can avert? How much will it cost? If we roll out dengue vaccination across the population, how much is it going to cost? How many cases will we avert? And both of these are important, and actually we work with NEA on both of those. But for the purpose of this talk, because I only got 15 minutes, and I could literally talk for hours and hours about dengue, I'm going to focus on nowcasting and short-term projections. And as with the previous speakers, I've chosen to have two examples for this. Right, so the first of the examples I want to talk about is how we can understand the factors that lie behind where mosquitoes breed in our urban environment, and to quantify the risk in different parts of the country. Okay, and so this is work that, as I keep on saying, it's with NEA. NEA have started to do something really cool over the last couple of years, which is to revolutionize how we do mosquito surveillance. And the way that they do that now is through using something called gravity traps. So gravity trap is about this size or so, and they are now scattered around by the country. At every HDB block should have at least one gravity trap there. At the bottom of the trap, there's a liquid, which is attractive to the mosquitoes. It smells like human feet, apparently. And so they will fly over to the gravity trap in order to lay their eggs. Now, what the mosquitoes don't know is that we cunningly put glue around the outside of it. So they land on the side to lay their eggs down, but they get stuck to the glue and they can't fly away again. And as you can see at the bottom, there's a mesh at the bottom of the trap. So separating between where the oviposit and then where the eggs get deposited to, there's this mesh so that even when the eggs hatch from the liquid, they're not able to fly out. Okay, so it has two purposes. One is that when we go down, when the officers go down and they harvest this once a fortnight, then we're able to use that to see where are the areas around about the country which have got more breeding. And the second is, slightly, it can reduce the vector mosquito directly because we're withdrawing some of the female adult mosquitoes from the population and we're preventing some of their offspring from hatching. So we've been working with NEA to analyze the spatial and temporal patterns of the data that come out of these gravity traps. And I'm going to show you, I had to give Dengue 101 example so I could explain what these two sets of Greek words are. Right, so the Aedes aegypti is the urban one, albopictus is the green one. And I'm going to show you the patterns around about all of our HDB estates in the country. What we have done is, firstly, we're trying to look at what is the risk in specific buildings, i.e. in different estates. Later on, I'll be talking about how we can try to identify what are the causes of that risk. So let's start with Aedes aegypti, because it's, as I said, the primary vector. Obviously, there's lots of places of the country which are not HDB estates and they don't have the gravity traps. But in all of the ones which do have HDB blocks, we've been able to drill down what is the average number of female mosquitoes that get picked up in these per fortnight. Darker red means that there's more female mosquitoes getting caught there, therefore probably more in the environment. So we can see that there's a lot of variability between areas which have got lower amounts of breeding and those with higher amounts of breeding. This potentially could mean then that we can target our vector control more efficiently by looking at the areas which are darker on this map. Okay, the second of the species, Aedes albopictus, one which is more in the green areas of the country. Now you can see that there's variability in albopictus prevalence, but the areas which have got more aegypti often have less albopictus and vice versa. I'm going to highlight a few of these. Maybe this is where you live, in which case you can find out what mosquito species is the one that bites you. Okay, so you can see, for example, Cheung village. Cheung village has a lot more albopictus. It does not have so much aegypti breeding. Another, contrary-wise, would be Bedok around the East Coast. So Bedok tends to have a lot of dengue cases. And also, when we have dengue outbreaks, it tends to be the East Coast gets affected earlier than the other parts of the country. And we can see partly why is because Aedes aegypti has got more breeding in Bedok area. And then Queenstown and Telok that's a bit more kind of switched around the other. It's got some of the urban mosquito, but it's also got more of the green mosquito alongside that. Okay, so that tells us the risk in different parts of the country, but what are the causes for that risk? So we can take the same data and we can analyze it using regression methods. And what do you think the causes might be? How much of it is due to climate and weather, and how much of it is due to the urban environment? Well, it turns out that actually the urban environment is much more important as a predictor for where the mosquito will be breeding than recent humidity and rainfall would be other weather variables. The primary determinant of how much mosquito breeding there is building age. Older estates have got a lot more mosquito breeding. And this is because there's, well, we think it's because there's factors around about the estate which are conducive for breeding. For example, around about the aircon vent at the back, that the older estates may have built-in trays in which stagnant water can sit and a mosquito can breed. Another difference would be, for example, the presence of guttering along the top of the HDB blocks. So after the 2005 dengue outbreak, which was the biggest on record at the time, has since been exceeded, HDB changed the design of their blocks such that they would remove that guttering. So unless I'm completely wrong here, then if you look at any HDB block which has got guttering, it should be pre-2005, because after that we stopped having it. Okay, so this, and if you want to find out more, you can, the QR code takes you through the paper. Okay, so the second of the examples I want to talk about is how we can take information like what I'm presenting here on the mosquito, and we can use it to create dynamic risk maps. So let me just explain how we do this in the context of our dengue forecast at the national level first, and then I'll talk about how we spatialize that. Okay, so for a decade now, which shows how old I am, we have been working with NEA to do national forecasts of dengue incidents around about the country as a whole. We started doing this in 2012. We had it up and running in time to predict the 2013, which was the next biggest outbreak on record. And so since then, we have been running this automatically. And I want to explain how we try to make these forecasts, because that will help us understand how we do the spatial forecast. So the first thing is that we've got these time series data. It's got counts of dengue over time. It's got weather variables over time, like average temperature, average humidity, etc. Actually works for all sorts of temporal data. The first thing that we're doing with this is that we're going to mung it into a different format. What we want to do is to move from time series data into data which is more like the kind you use for regression. Imagine like we're making a big Excel sheet. What we're going to do is we're going to take dengue cases, and that's going to be column A in your Excel sheet. And then by looking back in time through the time series data, we're able to take past dengue cases and put that in column B, C, D, etc. Like last week's dengue cases, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, etc. Or to take past temperature or past humidity or past all sorts of variables, stick that into like a really big Excel sheet, such that we've got one variable which is going to act like our dependent variable we want to try to predict, our Y, and then everything else becomes like a big X variable, right? Then we can just do regression on this. And that regression allows us then, if we run in regression model live, when new data comes in, we can now predict what future dengue cases will look like. So that lets us, using past dengue case data, we can now predict this week's dengue case counts, but we can take the same approach, but substitute in, from our historic data, substitute in future dengue cases. So let's say cases next week. So we use past dengue cases to predict next week's one, or 2 weeks hence, or 3 weeks hence. Okay. So as we do this, what we're doing is building separate models for each of these forecast windows. So when you saw the forecasts that I was presenting earlier, that's actually me lying to you all. We don't have one model which makes all these forecasts. Instead, we've got multiple models, one designed, one tailored for each forecast lag that we want to make the forecast for. And we splice them all together at the end, so it looks like it's one coherent algorithm. So we've been taking the same approach to do spatial forecasts forward in time, to identify neighborhoods that we think over the weeks ahead will have more dengue cases or less. And those with more, we can then prioritize for vector control. And the way that we do that is basically by taking that same approach. We're taking data and then coercing it into a different format, into a matrix format that allow us to then stick it all together into a really huge, humongous Excel sheet, and then do that Excel sheet like different tabs for different forecast windows and build models for each of those. Right? So actually, the statistical part of this is very trivial, and it would allow us to take the same approach for, as you think, quite a large number of other outcomes, not just looking at dengue. So it's by doing this, we're able to then create these maps, like I just showed you, where we can say, okay, this area around about, let's say in this case, Bidok is at quite high risk. And you can see that played out in terms of number of cases. So I hope that's given you a bit of a sense of how we use modeling analytics to try to help NEA with its vector control. I'm very proud that this has actually impacted on programmatic work by NEA. So when we predict that there's going to be a big outbreak, I'm very, very sad, but the NEA officers get their holiday cancelled so that they can be around to help control it. And when we predict areas which will be a higher risk, then these areas do get prioritized for additional vector control. So thank you very much for your attention. It would be remiss if I didn't thank my funders and also the people who really did the work, which is my great research team and students, as well as our collaborators at Environmental Health Institute at NEA. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Prof. Cook, for your sharing. It's so interesting to see how data analytics can be used to model public disease outbreaks and shape the urban strategies to mitigate diseases. We also want to thank everybody for your active participation on the Jamboard. If you have questions for Prof. Cook, we encourage you to post them in the Q&A feature or on the Jamboard itself. Our final program for today will be the Q&A panel discussion with our three speakers, Prof. Raubal, Prof. Hamel, and Prof. Cook. We are honored to have Prof. Paul Cheung as the moderator for this panel. Prof. Cheung is the director of the Asia Competitiveness Institute and the professor in practice at the LKY School of Public Policy. Prof. Cheung leads a team of researchers examining socio-economic development prospects of Singapore and the region. He was previously the chief statistician of Singapore and the director of United Nations Statistics Office. At the UN, he managed a global program on geospatial data and analytic systems. He also initiated the UN Multilateral Platform on Global Geospatial Information Management in 2011. To all our participants, we welcome all to field questions through the Q&A function and to vote for your favorite questions. Over to you, Paul Cheung.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I have attended many webinars. This is the first time that all the presenters are kept to the time, and then in fact, we have earned a few minutes in our panel discussion. Very rare event. We have heard three very interesting presentations on urban analytics, each focusing on a domain area. Martin has focused on sustainable mobility and how behavioral change could help to achieve this. Perrine discussed the use of urban analytics in areas of urban nature and how urban heat mitigation and urban biodiversity could be monitored. And Alex, of course, looked at our favorite topic, how to control dengue, how to forecast dengue, and by analogy, all the other mosquito-borne diseases. So we have about 30 minutes to discuss some salient issues about urban analytics. So as the MC has mentioned, you are welcome to pose the questions to the panelists. And so let me get the ball rolling and pose a couple of questions to the panelists first, and just get a general view on some general questions. So as domain experts with very strong analytical background, I think you agree with me that the urban analytics will get more important and get more recognition over time. So in 2016, The Economist magazine has already predicted that urban analytics is likely to be as important to a city dwellers' welfare as the power grid and the transportation system. So over time, we have seen a lot of interesting examples of how urban analytics have helped the city to become a better place to live. But I would like to ask the panelists, what would you consider as the two most important drivers that will bring the urban analytics to the next level of importance, of impact in your own domain area? What do you want to see? What are the two Christmas gifts you want Santa Claus to bring you in the area of urban analytics? Martin, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks, Paul, for the question. Very interesting. I think, I completely agree with you. Urban analytics and especially spatio-temporal analysis is important. And I was glad. It was not only my presentation, but what Perrine and Alex showed. You could also great cases where you see the importance of space, time, and data. I think in my domain, what is highly important is real-time data analytics, and this is still a problem. we have a lot of data, we can analyze the data, and then we can make predictions, but with many problems, we really don't have the computational power and the accessibility to real-time data. And in order to solve problems on the short term, we need that. And another thing that is more like a general opinion on the whole big data thing is that, when I was a student, it was hard to get data at all. Now we are kind of in a reverse situation that we have so much data that we have to find out which is really relevant and what is important, and mechanisms, like filter mechanisms to determine what is really the essence of the data that bring importance to our problem solving that would be needed too.
Thanks, Martin. In fact, after in Japan, after the Great Asian Tsunami, and the Japan authority was sharing with me that it's not that they don't have enough data about the impact of the tsunami, it's that they have too much data. They are overwhelmed with all kinds of data sources. And then from there, they evolve a protocol of filtering and tidying up the data sources so that during emergency, they know what to use. That's exactly, I guess, the point that you mentioned.
Yes.
Perrine, can I have your input?
Sure, and I was going to bring a similar point, but maybe from a slightly different angle. I think for me, the biggest frontier and our Christmas present, I think that's how you framed it, would be to have easier access to geospatial data. So not more data, we can always have more data. Yes, we can fly drones, we can track every single movement, every single tree in the city, but it's really about what we do with these data sets. So I'm really promoting free and open source software. Obviously, I'm teaching at a university where students get equipped with these geospatial skills as well. And I think this is a really important part of making sense of the data, whether it's for mobility or ecological nature in city or public health questions. It's really, I think, what is still missing in Singapore to some extent, but also in many, many different cities. So if we think about urban planning, empowering more people, not only the urban planning agencies, but also the civil society, to have access to these data for different uses is a really important way to make sure that it's what we would call a whole of society effort here in Singapore, as opposed to whole of government effort. So I think this would be the main point: easier access to data, which we could track with like how models like INVEST, but many other models are used and again taken up by the civil society.
Very good. Thanks so much, Karen. Yeah, Alex.
So I think that there's often a reluctance within government to make data available. I know that there has been a shift over recent years, but still, very often the data that you can extract out from government department web pages, for example, it tends to be quite crude and not actually at the level of resolution that makes the kind of work that we do meaningful and actually having any kind of impact. Now, I know that within my field, obviously there's additional complexities that these are data about people and then about the health of people, and that obviously has additional constraints applied to it. But I do sometimes wonder why it is that data which is not specifically around about individuals, but just about the environment or about the layout of the land, why it's not straightforward to access that kind of data, which is not so sensitive. So that I think that there's still quite a lot of sometimes barriers and reluctance to stick your neck out and to say, okay, let's make this data available for other people to use and get benefit from.
Exactly. Well, can I just push you a little bit more on this? I know that getting data, real-time data, getting accessible data from the government sometimes can be difficult, and most governments are reluctant. But then now with so many different types of sensors available, and then the IoT stuff, and then other NGOs are getting into the action. What I was trying to mention is really the pollution monitoring data, air pollution monitoring data. There are many, even the American embassies in Kathmandu or NGOs are setting up all kinds of sensors to do their own tracking, because either they don't trust the government data or they couldn't get access to it. How do you see this trend? Can we harvest those new type of sensor-based data from non-government sources? Do you have any experience in using this particular approach, particularly, say, for example, in urban nature or in transportation or in epidemiological work? Anyone would want to try?
I can start. Yeah, definitely. I think you're referring to a lot of different practices, among them citizen science. And this is something that a lot of researchers in our fields, I would say, would use to access more data. And this is not necessarily because data exists and is not accessible or made available, but also just to collect more and more data with the co-benefits of involving the population. Again, super important when we're talking about urban systems, to kind of raise awareness to different issues. So this, I would say, is an important point. We're actually exploring in one of our projects in the lab the use of low-cost sensors for urban water management, because sometimes it's also that we don't have so much data because it is expensive to monitor, in that case, water quality, water quantity, not only the sensors themselves, but then maintaining and compiling the data sets, making them available. So we are looking into these low-cost sensors for Singapore as well as lower income countries that could really make a difference in the knowledge that we gain from nature-based solutions and water management.
Yeah, thanks, Perrine. Yeah, Martin?
Yeah, maybe I can add, because I mean, implicitly you're referring to data quality. And I think from my experience, I mean, mainly in Switzerland, but also from data that we have here in the Future Resilient Systems, that with government data, you can be sure of the data quality. And that is most often the case. So if you look at the, cartographic and map data or digital elevation model data from the Swiss Topo, from the Swiss government, then basically you have to pay for the data, but you get a good quality. I'm more worried about data sources that come from everywhere and go where you don't know about the data quality. I mean, even with Google Maps, nobody would take a Google map and use it for planning purposes because you don't know about the data quality. And another interesting thing is we just got this third phase of the Digital Underground project funded, where I'm a PI in Singapore. That's a collaboration with the SLA. And there a big issue is that often with the legacy data, with some of the old data, we don't know about the data quality. So how do you actually integrate that with new data where we know about the data quality? So I think there are different things, but in general, I would say that government data is trustworthy.
No, definitely, Martin, that's the gold standard. But the problem is that they're also keeping the gold in the Federal Reserve Bank, and they don't want to share the gold as well. That's a problem.
That's a problem, yeah, I agree.
Okay, Alex, you anything to add on this?
Yeah.
Low-cost sensors, alternative sources of information.
So if you've got one data set, then you get one piece of value from it. If you've got two data sets, then you get also the interactions between those. And if you've got three, then you get, you start to get quadratic or exponential numbers of potential value from that. And so there's certain implicit value to having comprehensive data sets where it's not just like you collect it for 6 months and then like your funding runs out and you stop collecting the data, or you don't just collect it for NTU campus or NUS campus or whatever, and then it's not, because if so, then you have fragmented data, which is not useful for interacting with other data sets. So I think that to me is one of the major advantages of having government data, especially in the Singapore context, because within the city is the country. So we're able to get really comprehensive data across the country as well as across the city. And so I think that it's great if people are creating their own data and they're making it available, but still fundamentally, we have to let the government to do it for us.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Let me ask one more general question. It's also linked to the themes in your research before I pose some specific questions to based on your presentation. So there is a growing recognition that for urban analytics to be useful, they should go beyond just pattern identification and move into predictive and even prescriptive analytics. And if you look at your presentation just now, or you present a problem, presented the analytics, and there's a clear solution. The solution is that have to switch over to less, more energy efficient transportation, use better urban nature services, and as well as remove all the dengue potential sources of dengue areas. And so, do you agree with this? Because if we take it to the limit, if all the government go into all these predictive analytics and they really adopt all your recommendations and start coming up with all kinds of policies that you must do this, you must do that, then are we going into area of behavioral change and social engineering? And so where's the limit? From how far would you push your own recommendations?
Maybe I go first. I mean, Singapore's famous for that. I mean, we have paternalistic government, and everyone seems to accept and acknowledge it. I mean, we have all these environmental nudges, like our MRT stations are designed to try to get people to walk up rather than just always get the escalator up. We designed our HDB blocks such that we've got the bottom floor being like a communal space. These so that we can get more interactions between different groups in the population. Yeah, we always do that. There's no problem with it.
Yeah, Alex, I know exactly what you mean, because I was in charge of Singapore's population policy in the past, and that's exactly what we do. Stop at 2 and have more if you later on, and so on and so forth. But it's a good thing to do for academics. How far can we push urban analytics?
And maybe I can go next. So I think as academics, we have a certain freedom. We can explore methods. We can go, a long way. But this doesn't mean that everything will be. We can offer solutions. But then, it's that's why I also had in my presentation is a complex problem involving politics, economy, everything. But I think 2 examples. I think when you have a clear problem, and predictive analytics can actually help solve such a problem, also for the good of the people. Like, CO2 emissions, obviously our air quality, climate change is bad for people. So if we can do something there, then we're actually doing something good for the people who live in the city. And I think if I consider myself as a citizen, then I would be very happy if I get better air quality and so on and so forth. I mean, your question also relates to this problem of AI. How far do we want to go with AI? At some point, we'll all be robots, and and what is the meaning of human life? Actually, that might be a little bit far, but I mean, when I hear social engineering, it goes kind of in that direction. Yeah. But I'm more thinking of practical problems. Another is with e-mobility. If we ever want to make use of like wasted energy in e-mobility through vehicle to grid strategies, then obviously we can do something good for our energy system. We can save energy, and with predictive analytics, we can actually help give energy back to the grid where is more useful than being wasted. So I think you have to make a distinction between the actual problems and look into each problem separately, whether that's worth it and whether that has a good impact or might have a negative impact.
Yeah, thanks. Very good. Yeah. Whether Perrine, you have anything to add?
Well, perhaps just briefly, and also because I'm seeing a question in the Q&A box, so perhaps I'll try and address it at the same time. Are there any commonalities across this urban analytics model? And so to me, it gets back to this question of having different objectives, mobility, nature, public health, and trying to put them together and understand that yes, it's a system complex. It's a complex system that we live in our city, but we need to bring the best of our knowledge in these different fields to try and find solutions. So this is really what we're trying to do from an urban nature perspective when we think about flood risk, when we think about mental health, physical health as well. But obviously there are other important issues and objectives that the city would have that are not only related to nature. And so Singapore is actually obviously doing a lot of excellent work when we think about digital twins, this idea of having models that represent all these things together. And a lot of us, or at least the nerdy part of us, would be really pushing and promoting these models because yes, they are extremely powerful. I think I always try and caution against like putting too much reliance on these models as well, because very often the way we ask questions to these models is already 50%, if not more, of the question, so of the answer. So this is to remind us that yes, urban analytics are extremely powerful, but at the end of the day, there are a lot of political decisions involved in the way we ask questions and we answer them.
Yeah, exactly. But Perrine, in your answer, you touched on a topic that one of the participants in this webinar has asked. He said that he heard that from Martin, the transportation model, he heard from you on the urban nature model, and from Alex, the epidemiological model, and each one is domain specific. Is it possible to have a grand model that covers all the disciplines that can be used a little bit more generic or general systems model, or you know, I mean, I don't know whether this is the holy grail. They're looking for some solution that can apply to all the disciplines. Would somebody coming in to learn urban analytics that they can learn something that's a basic, they can cut across all the disciplines? Alex, you look like you are ready to.
Okay. Yeah. Let me have a stab at this, and then maybe Perrine can go after. So even within the field of infectious disease modeling, which you would think is very niche, we use different models for different stuff. I mean, you would never use a dengue model to try to predict COVID or HIV transmission or something. I mean, you need to tailor it to the specific use case. But I do think that there's a lot of commonalities. Like I was just answering in the chat that, for example, I mean, we often use GIS data. I'm sure that the other two also are using GIS layers from, and so there's kind of like some standards that you can use, but that is just that you may need to take it, like in my case, I take it out of the GIS, I do subsequent analysis and modeling outside of that framework. So I think that it's probably harder than with the case of something like the weather, where everything can get kind of almost like condensed down into a single framework. I think that we're probably never going to have that even within disciplines like dengue, influenza, COVID, etc. Over.
Okay, all right. Martin, what do you think? You think that it's not possible to have something interoperable?
Well, there are certain efforts that go in this direction, but I completely agree with the meaning of the question, basically that we're dealing with complex systems. So like at the Singapore ETH Center, overall, we're looking at many systems of systems approaches, and the subsystems are all interconnected. I mean, if you look, for example, there was also one question in the chat about the time dependence of the mobility, the seasonal dependence. Of course, there are seasonal dependencies. So without including weather data and some other data, you don't get the whole picture. You also need to have economical data. What can people afford? What are they willing to pay, etc., etc. But I mean, in that sense, the best map of the Earth would be in a scale 1:1, but that is very hard to use, as we know. And a comprehensive, I mean, digital twins go in that direction, and the comprehensive digital twin would be the best thing. But I think you have to abstract somewhere. I mean, you cannot have a 1:1 representation of everything that is going on. But aiming for that is for sure a good thing.
Okay. Perrine, you want to just add a bit more?
No, I think I already
Okay.
shared my views on this, so I think there are a number of questions we can move on.
Okay, now there are a lot of questions, and then so I'm going to select some questions that are more specific to each of the presentation. But given the time, I will hope that your answer could be short and sharp. And but the questions I choose are a bit more direct. And so in the case, Martin, in your presentation, some participants have asked that at the end of the day, the key conclusion is really the use of e-cars, which means that substituting something energy more efficient from ordinary car to e-car. So governments are going into incentivizing this. So essentially, is that the main conclusion in your order in the urban analytics that you're doing?
Well, in that package, I mean, definitely the e-cars were the main factor for CO2 emission reduction. But you also have to see, you know, the climate where we had this study. I mean, one problem was also, I mean, many ways in cities could also be done by e-bikes. But if you have like -10 degrees in the winter in Switzerland, then people are reluctant to use the e-bike. So in that sense, actually, you have much better conditions here. But I think what is also important is, you know, that what I call green modes, you know, biking, walking, and so on and so forth. I mean, you see, especially in the US, I mean, I used to live in the US for many years, and there people would take the car, you know, if they have to go 300 meters to the supermarket. And that's something, you know, where people could change their behavior and maybe, you know, take the bike or walk. So e-cars will definitely become part of the solution, but not only.
Right. So, Perrine, both Perrine and Martin, you talk about mobility as a service, and then Perrine talk about ecosystem as a service. And there was an interesting question. In your models, have you considered this service, the negative aspect of, because we keep modeling on the positive side. So there is some kind of leading the conclusion that something is good. But what about the negative aspects? Is there a negative these services there?
Yeah, that's a really good question and an important one. I briefly mentioned at the beginning the human-wildlife conflicts, which is something that we may want to take into account in Singapore. Other types of disservices or inconveniences from nature, maybe the use of water in cities that are water scarce. Trees do use a lot of water to grow, so this may be a disservice. Traditionally, the invest models have not focused on the disservices, and this comes from the legacy of conservation science. The whole idea behind ecosystem services was to demonstrate that nature had value. So there's more of a focus on these benefits. But of course, when we get to these nitty-gritty and detailed planning questions, we do want to consider these services. Being habitat for mosquitoes, to link to Alex's presentation, would be one example. So the whole idea is to find best management practices to mitigate and reduce these services. And so more specifically, to answer the question, the invest models would typically not represent them very accurately.
Martin, is there any disservice in mobility as a service?
Well, I don't know whether
us to certain kind of transportation mode. Like in Singapore, they use traffic lights to force us to not use the cars, not to drive.
Yeah, one thing that came to mind actually is it's kind of an indirect disservice. Is we always talking about more sustainable mobility options, but if you look at mobility as a service, you know, this comes at the cost of an extensive computing infrastructure. And of course, computing infrastructures also lead to, you know, energy consumption and CO2 output, but this is most often not factored in. And I think we need more research to actually find out what is the negative impact of using such a huge computing infrastructure. And maybe one small thing to be brief, what we saw, such mobility as a service comes at a price. So when we actually compared our study participants to the microcensus of Switzerland, and we found that the study was a bit biased, meaning, you know, high income people who can afford such a package. And that's why SVB is now actually selling these packages in various components also so that, you know, lower income people can afford such a package.
Right. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, Alex. Just now you mentioned about the possible interaction of data sources, and so I was curious that when you're talking about the forecasting dengue, and you are saying that in your forecast model, actually you have different models that composite that bring together the ultimate forecast outcomes. So I was just curious, are there any interaction between all the different models? Because you seem to have 4 or 5 models built into one single forecasting equation.
Yeah, we have 20 models, one for each week ahead. We try to forecast months into the future. They don't interact with each other, and that actually was one of the mental blocks that we initially had, was that we felt that there should be one common model that would apply for them all. But the problem then is that you have to, if I want to predict dengue in 2 weeks' time, that means I have to be able to predict all of the weather stuff next week, which means I'm moving away from public health. I'm moving back to the Met Office or something, right? So the different features which are predictive of dengue have different effects over different timeframes. So for example, if you're trying to predict dengue next week, the best predictor for that is dengue this week.
Yeah, of course.
Right. But if you're trying to predict dengue 3 months from now, then yeah, sure, dengue this week's important. But also you want to know more about weather conditions, because that's going to lead to more breeding now, which will lead to more mosquitoes in a few weeks' time, which will lead to more dengue cases, even more weeks' time from that, and so on. So the effect is felt differently for the different predictors at different forecast windows. That's why it has to be done as separate models.
Sure, that's very clear. Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah. So I have one last question. We have 5 more minutes, 4 more minutes to end this. In Singapore, to push further urban analytics, we need to organize an urban information system, so that the practitioners can draw on from this system, or draw on the data to do all kind of urban analytics. Right now, the data sources are fragmented; they're all over the place, and then very hard to get access to. Unless Alex has a contact with the government environment agency, so he has the data on dengue, and other people have other contacts, but it's not systematic. How can we build such an urban information system? From your own country, from international experience, what would be your advice? Very quickly, how we can build such a system that everybody can use the data to do their urban analytics? Who want to go first?
Okay, maybe I go first then. So I think there should be a single common repository where the usage rights are clearly laid out, and that there's some form of like trust. Like for example, the trust network, which is being set up to allow for human data sharing between different institutes, would be one approach for that. So that if there is a particular restriction on how you can use data set A, then that is clearly laid out, and then you cannot use it for other purposes. But it can still be there on the repository. Yeah, I think that would be one approach.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. Yeah, I think in the UK they have a very good urban information depository. Yeah. Perrine, Martin.
Yeah, I'll just add that I may be naive, but I don't think the technological barriers are actually the largest barriers here. There are a lot of really good examples of open data initiatives, including in the region. A number of governments are jumping on this bandwagon. So that's, I think, a question of what do we consider as sensitive information in Singapore, and how do we make it available to researchers and civil society?
Well, in Singapore, all information is sensitive. Yeah, from the government point of view. Yeah, Martin, any?
Yeah, I think I want to highlight this is a very, very important problem and is usually solved through spatial data infrastructures. And worldwide, there are many examples on a national level, on the European level, you have the INSPIRE framework. And I think the most important thing that comes into play here is the social component, namely all the government agencies really must be willing to talk to each other and work together to establish this common goal, because with such a spatial data infrastructure, you can do a lot of good, and you can save a lot of time that is usually wasted in not getting data, not finding data, etc.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think urban analytics can move on. I think we now have a lot of good models, and we have we know the importance of it, and we have good models, good quantitative techniques. Now, if we can have easy access to data, I think this field will be able to go much, much further. I would say that data and technology are the key to the future prospects of urban analytics. So with that, it's 3:59. Oh, I gone over time. So sorry about that. I misread the time. So now, sorry. I will now end this panel discussion. Pass back to the MC. Hello.
Thank you all once again. I would like to express our appreciation to our speakers and moderator for taking time off their busy schedules to be with us today. And to all our participants, thank you for giving us your attention this Friday afternoon. Before we end today's session, allow me to make a few announcements, which will also be screened after the webinar. So today's webinar is actually the first in a two-part series on urban analytics. Coming next Friday, we will be having our second webinar on cities in the age of AI. In this webinar, distinguished speakers will be sharing more on the different ways that AI can be used to improve urban planning and design. If you would like to continue learning with us on the potential of urban analytics in shaping our urban environment, do scan the QR code and register. Beyond urban analytics, if you are interested to learn more about our e-Symposia series, we would also like to invite you to visit our portal. Through the portal, not only can you view past webinars and sign up for upcoming ones, you can also share your suggestions to help us shape our RIE 2025 plans and access various schemes to support your innovation needs. The portal can be accessed via the QR code as shown. Finally, as urban analytics is going to be a key focus of our Cities of Tomorrow research journey, we are very interested to hear your ideas and explore how we can work together on exciting projects. As such, we would like to strongly encourage you to fill out the survey that you'll be auto-directed to once you close this webinar. If you have any other questions or ideas that you'd like to share with us after the webinar, please do not hesitate to drop us an email via the email address here. And with that, we have come to the end of today's session, and we hope that you have found the session insightful and productive. I would also like to express our appreciation to our guest speakers for taking time off to be with us today. Thank you all for joining us once again, and have a pleasant weekend ahead. Goodbye.